right. Happy Friday, Dr. Richards.
Happy Friday, Dr. Leib. Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Big weekend. I'm here in the Poconos. We got the lacrosse championships this weekend, it's a big deal in our area at least.
Yeah. No, it should be. I'm going tomorrow. It should be a good turnout. I think usually they get like 30 or 40,000, so that'll be cool. Biggest,
Yeah,
I mean, lacrosse event by far in the year, so it'll be
yeah.
good.
I mean, I love the sport. I'm falling in love with it. I'm happy to be in the Poconos, but I actually wish I could be there at the link tomorrow to watch the games. But I'll be
Yeah,
watching them on TV.
should be good. Should be good. I'm kind of a Penn State fan. I
Yeah,
don't
I'm cheering
know.
for Penn State. I'm
Yeah,
sure, but
well, I'm cheering for him, but I'm not like a diehard
right.
Penn State football fan.
Yeah, likewise. I actually like Notre Dame too because I like the Kavanaugh brothers quite a bit. Like I wouldn't mind seeing
They're
them
fun to
do.
watch.
Yeah, I've been watching Pat for the last several years. Like feel like he's that guy. He deserves it. But
Yeah,
yeah, I think I'm cheering for Penn State. I wouldn't mind to see Penn State. Who does Penn State play first? Do they play Notre Dame?
Duke. They
They
play
play
Duke.
Duke. Yeah, I wouldn't mind
Yeah.
seeing Notre Dame and Penn State in the championship.
Yeah, that'll be good. I just kind of want like a change up. Like no more Virginia, no more
Right,
Duke, like
right,
something else. So
absolutely.
yeah, I'll take it. Whatever. Notre Dame or Penn State, I'll take it.
Yeah, seems like a college football, well, old school college football championship. I like
Rematch. Yeah.
yeah, where I grew up, it was like, yeah, everybody loved Penn State, but like anywhere you live, people love Notre Dame. So it was like
Yeah.
you either loved Penn State or Notre Dame. So
Yeah. America's team. Are they
absolutely,
America's? Something like that.
I don't
Yeah.
know. All right, so today we're gonna take on the topic of nutrition, and we'll just try to hit it from our perspective. We're physical therapists, fitness experts, if you will, like fitness specialists, but we're not, licensed dietitian by any means. But we do have to deal with nutrition quite a bit in the work that we do. So, with that caveat, we'll talk about it within the limits of our scope. Um,
Yep.
and I think it's important to put it together with how exercise and nutrition come together. So I think like the first thing to talk about here, or at least the way that I look at this, is understanding the calories in, calories out equation, or the energy balance equation. And there's a lot of controversy around it being like an equation, but I think that the controversy is because there's sort of a misunderstanding of what's being talked about and what fits into the equation. So when I was writing Longevity Through Movement at the end, I wanted to discuss aesthetics and exercise for changing your body composition and things like that, and also in just describing the difference or discussing the difference between trying to exercise or eat for a certain aesthetic versus for health and longevity. And sometimes they go hand in hand, but it's not always the same thing. So nutrition is a big part of that discussion about aesthetics, but it also has the same type of contrast in a way where if you're eating or your nutrition is to change your aesthetics, it's not necessarily the same thing as doing it for health. So we have to talk about the intention around your dietary intention, like why are you eating a certain way, or why are you choosing to pay attention to your nutrition at all. And I think all of that fits into this equation if we break it down correctly. So, from my perspective, we have like the energy in equation, or the side of the equation, which is basically just the food that we take in, and that's influenced by basically our appetite, and also, awareness of, what we're eating, tracking, and things like that. And that can be influenced by our blood sugar levels. That could be influenced by hormonal balance, like leptin, ghrelin. Leptin inhibits hunger, ghrelin promotes hunger. There's just different hormones that could be happening or elevated in our body at different times that make us want to eat more and not want to eat more. I think one of the major factors, though, that we, for in our current culture, is to be able to have some type of strategy for tracking how much we're eating, because I think if we just sort of leave it to our hunger signals, we're probably going to be deceived more often than not for how much we're eating. And sometimes that's too much. A lot of times that's too much if you look at the data and the statistics of how many people are overweight, but sometimes it's not enough too. So
Mhm.
that's that side of the equation tends to be a little bit simpler, is just what you're putting in your body. The other side of the equation is energy out, tends to be, I think, a little bit more complex. And I think that's where a lot of the controversy comes, whether, well, calories don't matter at all. We just have to, pay attention to how much sugar we're eating, or we just have to make sure that we're only eating meat, right? And then, get into these discussions of like totally eliminating certain foods and totally eliminating certain macronutrients. And then you get in sort of like a religious debate about, what team you're on. But it's all that still fits into this energy out equation if we kind of break it down. So the number one thing in the energy out equation is your resting metabolic rate, which is basically the amount of calories that you're burning when you're doing nothing, when you're at rest. And that's influenced by age, it's influenced by your genetics, muscle mass, things like that. So this is where I think, as movement professionals, we come into play the most, is understanding that, depending on who you read, this is about 60 to 75% of your energy out is going to be coming from your resting metabolic rate. So here, the way that we can influence that is we just get people stronger, we get people faster, we get people doing things better, right? So we basically get people fitter. And that's the way that I look at resting metabolic rate. We get them fitter, but we get them fitter in a more versatile way. So it's not just exercising, it's exercising with the intention to get better at things, right? And if you're walking around with more fitness, a lot of times your resting metabolic rate improves. And then there's things that you can influence, like your age, your gender, and your genetics. But that's a big one right there.
Mhm.
And we'll discuss a little deeper on that. But I just want to go through all of the factors, and then we'll go from
Yeah.
there. The second thing would be just the thermic effect of food. So the thermic effect of food is it's a small amount of the calories that you burn, but I think the major influence there is, we could talk about like why certain foods might be more valuable than others. So protein tends to be the macronutrient that has the greatest thermic effect. So eating a little bit more protein can give us a little bit more calorie burn naturally. My thought process on that would be that it's probably a minimal effect, right? So
Yeah.
again, thinking about, well, I want to eat protein just so I can burn more calories. There's other reasons to eat protein, but that might be the least of them. But if you're going to think about the different foods, like protein will have a greater thermic effect, and that's part of the energy balance equation. The third thing would be just non-exercise activity. Just how much are we moving throughout the course of the day in a manner that is not purposeful exercise, right? And we've had a whole discussion, a whole podcast on that. You can think of it as step counting, but it would just be, how active are you without purposely going to the gym in some type of program? And then the last thing would be purposeful exercise. So, and purposeful exercise, as much as exercise is important from a energy balance standpoint, it's actually percentage wise a very small amount. Like depending on the studies that you look at, so it could be only about 5% of your daily energy expenditure comes from purposeful exercise. So that's where I think, so that number could be misleading, because I think if you go back into the discussion about resting metabolic rate, purposeful exercise is also the thing that can improve your resting metabolic rate the most if you have a good training program. But if the
Mhm.
intention of your training is not just about burning calories, but it is about improving your attributes.
Right.
And then one last thing that fits into all of that is hormones and stress and things like that. So you get things like cortisol being increased sort of naturally makes you store more fat than use it for energy. And insulin would be another one. So you can kind of look at, that's where food quality might come into play. That's where sleep weight come into play, and just your overall stress, certainly, and
Mhm.
things like gender comes into play, like being postmenopausal. All of that will have an effect on hormones. But to me, that still fits into the equation around resting metabolic rate, where it's just like your daily expenditure goes more towards storage than it does towards burning. So I just
Right.
talked a lot there. So what's your take on
I actually
that?
had a follow-up question about that.
Sure.
I think a lot of people probably are thinking
Mm-hmm.
of our however many listeners we have.
Mm-hmm.
I've gotten the question a lot, and I'm sure you get it. Like, people wear daily trackers a lot, and usually they give an estimate of some type of calorie burn or something like that. What's kind of the conversation you have with people surrounding that? When people come to you and are like, all right, I burnt this many calories today, so I can eat more on today versus this day, I see I don't. How do what's your take on that estimation, and how do you talk with clients about that?
Well, I think it depends on what strategy you're using in any moment, right? So it's one thing to understand the basics of a calories in, calories out equation, and then you have to have your specific strategy for you that you are assessing over time, right? So I have myself done where I look at how many calories I'm burning throughout the course of the day, using different trackers. So one of my favorite ones is the Polar Beat. So if I'm wearing a chest strap heart rate monitor and I do purposeful exercise, sometimes I will use the calories burned in those sessions to add on to the calories I'm allotting for the day. But I have a specific assessment plan for that. So I'm going to basically see, is this allowing me to reach my goals? If my goals are weight loss, then am I losing weight in the way that I want to using that strategy? Right. So I think that's a fine strategy to use. You have to know what your strategy is, and you have to be willing to change it if it's not working. Right. So there's definitely been times where that worked. And then I think with anything in nutrition, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but your body tends to adapt to the things that work initially. So you have to be willing to adapt yourself and change if you're hitting a plateau or if the things that work stop working. Right. And I've had that experience specifically, with that question, where I was losing weight using that strategy, and then I wasn't. Right. So then I had to change my strategy. So I think it just becomes a matter of tactics and strategies.
Yeah. Well, and that ties back into the basal metabolic rate conversation too, right? Because if you're losing weight as a generalization, if you weigh less, you're going to tend to have a lower, right? Let's say body composition is equal in terms of like body fat percentage. Someone weighs 220 pounds versus someone who weighs 150. Yeah. Wouldn't the basal metabolic rate would be lower for the lighter person versus a little bit higher potentially for the
potentially,
if all other things are equal.
If all other things are equal. Yeah. But that's the other thing too. It's like, it's really, this is where I think the controversies tend to come up in nutrition is although we can understand that equation, it's really, really hard to monitor some parts of it. Right. So, and I think, basal metabolic rate becomes one of the hardest things, one of the more important things, but also probably one of the hardest things to know for sure. There are ways you can monitor it. I don't know how accurate they are. But they're not easy, right? So you usually have to go to some type of lab to kind of get that monitored. And if it's a dynamic thing that is changing, it's hard to be monitoring it frequently enough to maybe see some of those changes. So you have to make some other assumptions on top of other things you're doing, and that's where we have other type of things that we might monitor that would say be some type of gateway to our basal metabolic rate, like sleep, like our stress levels may be connected to HRV, right? So if we're looking at our heart rate variability, and that's where we want it to be, and we're looking at our sleep, and that's where we want it to be, and then we're looking at things like muscle mass, right, body composition from that perspective, strength, right, and speed, right? So like all of these things can come together, in my opinion, to help us improve our basal metabolic rate, and ultimately it's comparing you to you, not you to somebody else, right? Like, so your baseline and get all those things better, and you would think that you're going to be moving that basal metabolic rate, that needle, where you want to move it.
And I guess like the reason I was bringing that up too is just, if you're thinking, say you're going for some type of weight loss for whatever reason, whether it's aesthetic purposes or metabolic health, whatever the goal is, a lot of times, like you said, things need to change as you go. So the strategy you use for that first 5 pounds that you lose might have to change for the next 5 pounds you lose.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And there's a lot of strings to pull with that, obviously, but and it's always imperfect math. I think it's like best guesses, but it is calculated. But like you said, when things are changing so dynamically, it's always an estimation to a certain certain
Yeah.
extent, right?
And I think what's important is to look at your nutritional journey as a journey, not as just a bunch of individual diets that,
Mhm.
or a bunch of individual belief systems that you sort of take on a new belief system, you throw the old one away, right? So every time you have a strategy from a nutrition standpoint, you hopefully learn something from that you can build on, right? And then you can start to see what works best for you. But you also know that you're going to likely have to change that again. But it becomes easier to make those changes as you get more educated on the nutritional process, right? And I,
Mhm.
I think this is one of the things that I see, and I've certainly gone through this myself in my years of doing different things from a dietary standpoint, is that there isn't this idea of like you're building an education. There's more of this idea of like what's the best way to eat now, right? And and that somebody's doing the work to do the research on figuring out actually the best way for everybody to eat. And that to me just doesn't exist. What exists is gaining more knowledge about the fundamentals of nutrition. And to me, nutrition is more of a behavioral process than it is about what to eat, right? So
Mhm.
you will eventually figure out, you might have some foundations that, I got to make sure I get these things in, but ultimately you'll be the one, kind of tweaking things based on the stuff that you're monitoring and the intentions that you have, right? So I think
Mhm.
that's sort of like where I hope we can kind of gear this discussion towards, like what are
Yep.
some of the foundational things that we want to be looking at? How do we monitor them?
Mhm.
And then talking about different intentions that you might have around nutrition and diet, and then how you might actually change what you monitor based on um, those intentions.
Yeah. I think you like you touched on, the kind of calories in, calories out discussion is probably kind of the base or umbrella under which everything else falls. Like you said, like there's so many different kinds of, I don't really know what I call them, but just like types of elimination
Mm-hmm.
diets, other things like that, that at the end of the day are manipulating to a certain extent the calories in, calories out
Right. Exactly.
equation. I think, some things to consider that would be kind of foundational from a nutrition perspective, where everything falls under that, is, you've got your three macronutrients that you're working with
Right.
between protein, carbohydrates, and fats. You can look at, the actual micronutrients that you're getting from all your foods, and then you can also compare both quantity and quality. And I know, you've played around with a lot of different things in your journey of nutrition, but where's your kind of thought process surrounding those big concepts, and how do you tend to look at all that? I know that's a broad question, but
No,
light riff a little bit.
I think that is a good question. Where it's like the foundations for me are, knowing how much you're eating, and knowing how much you're eating starts with looking at calories. And right, calories don't have to be the be all end all, but you that's probably one of the easiest strategies to actually know what you're eating, although it's imperfect, right? Another way to do that, and I've gone through the precision nutrition
Mhm.
certification, and the way that they look at quantity is they use sort of different hand measurements, right? Like the size of your hand. And I actually forget the specifics, but I think it has to do with like the size of your hand would be for your protein portion. It might be like the size of your thumb for a fat portion, but they just use different parts of your actual body to be the way that you're looking at your portion sizes. Right. And I think that works fine too. Like you just have to have a strategy that you stay consistent with. I like
Mhm.
using calorie counters because it's, if my life changes and I can't eat like a plated meal all the time, where I actually have like the same portions every time, I can actually accumulate calories throughout the course of a day. I can look at it throughout the course of the week. And most of the apps now have the ability for you to look at a bunch of different things all in one app. So you can look at your calories, but then if I want to look at my macronutrients, I could do that. If I want to look at my micronutrients, I can do different versions of that. I think the key is just knowing what works best for you. So my recommendation would be something like on MyFitnessPal, or one of the many apps that are out there. Noom is another one that I know a lot of my clients use, and just getting acquainted with it. Just get started with measuring without actually changing anything. Just monitor, right? Like just write down diary what you eat on a regular basis. Now we actually have some baselines that we can manipulate. All right. And then we have to ask, the broader question is, what are you trying to change? Many people are trying to lose weight. Well, if you're trying to lose weight, I think you start with at least calories, but you have to then look at, all right, do you have elevated blood sugar? Are you on a regular basis high with your blood sugar? Well, that might be something else you have to monitor. And if so, if you have a problem with blood sugar, then maybe you have to look at your macronutrients as well and keep your carbohydrates lower than someone else who doesn't have a problem with that. Right. So there's never a definitive, but having more information never hurts. And I think that is, to me, like one of the things I've changed my mind about the most when it comes to nutrition is getting away from the idea of certain foods are good and certain foods are bad, and just having more information. And then I can manipulate that information based on what my body needs at different times. So that to me is like the foundation is the monitoring. And then you're monitoring calories, macronutrients, micronutrients, but you don't have to monitor them all the time, right? Like you just have to have the know-how to do it. When the time comes that you want to manipulate different ones, you can change what you decide to look at, and you can see how those changes maybe affect some other things.
Yeah, I've noticed, interestingly, like in my setting, working with a fair amount of kind of more competitive, I guess, younger kind of folk, is actually the theme of a lot of people potentially are undernourished or aren't eating quite enough for their goals. And, we see that play out potentially in physical performance as well as like actually how they're feeling in the days after training and things like that. So getting them to monitor from that perspective and understanding sometimes it's actually okay, if not necessary, to eat more if the goal is let's be stronger, whatever it is we're going to do. But I always think can be a tough conversation having that initial talk about monitoring something. And sometimes, like personally, I'll just have people start monitoring one thing, whether it's like, okay, let's just get an idea of, for example, how much protein you're getting in a day. And then it's a little bit less, I think, overwhelming for them than like, okay, I need to measure everything. But that's kind of where I'd like to try to get them eventually, if it's needed. And if it's not, and they're meeting their goals, then it's like, okay, great. Let's not get more specific than we necessarily need to. Absolutely. But I think it's valuable to have the know-how and understanding about how to do that, so that you can then get more general when you need to.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's a difference between what might be optimal to do and what someone can do in a certain moment in time. Right. And that's where when you're working with humans, right, like you have to be willing to have a discussion with someone, and you ultimately have to be able to work with someone's behavior more than you actually need to like tell somebody what to do. Right. So it's like, it's actually listening and figuring out what's the first thing that you can do to make a change. Right. And that was a thing that was basically the foundation of precision nutrition is not the what to eat, but more so the how to get people to change. Right. It was very much in cognitive behavioral therapy, which I think was awesome, because it's something that we're very familiar with as trainers and therapists for getting people to do exercises, right? Like we understand that some people are more compliant than others. And there's all these different factors in somebody's life that would get in the way of compliancy. So you have to have, the same type of mentality where it's like, you can't just overload people with all the knowledge that you currently have, right? You have to see what's the first thing that they can get started with. But I think the most important thing to get people to understand is this is a process. This is not, like an intervention that will fix you, right? There's nothing to fix. There's just more to learn. And I don't think that could be stated more, or that can't be made more important, really. Like that is the foundation to me of nutrition. It's the foundation of exercise too, and movement, that there's no real endpoint. There's just learning. And then that learning allows you to be flexible as you change as a human. So that's super important with nutrition. So that's where I think the monitoring oftentimes becomes like a big part of the learning process. But so does, like, if your first step is just give one thing up, right? For a lot of people, it's, give up soda or something like that, or just drink less of soda. Like take one food product that you can do less with. And that's a great start, because you learn from that process. And, we might find that obvious that would be a big deal, but for somebody who's never done it before, they might be shocked to see the actual effect of doing that. And now that positive feedback starts a positive feedback loop that allows them to do other behaviors. So, and there's basically three ways you can actually look at, I think, manipulating how much you're consuming. And one of them becomes caloric restriction, which would just be what we're talking about, is just actually monitoring your calories and eating less of it. But the second one that I think is very common is dietary restriction, or just renunciation of certain foods. So it'd be like elimination versus moderation, right? Like I think if you're monitoring your calories, you're still eating calories, but you're just modifying, you're moderating, right? But then there's the tactic of just take a food and eliminate it. And for a lot of people, that's an easier strategy, right? I just caution people when they do that not to vilify the thing they're eliminating. Like, don't turn it into something that's evil. Just think like this might help you right now, right? And then be willing to maybe go deeper at another point, either eliminate something else, or maybe you do get into the moderation game later on so that things can be more sustainable. But again, having that victory, that kind of simple victories early on by making some change that has an effect is huge. And then the third strategy would, which kind of like can fit both of the other two in it, would be time restriction, which would be fasting. And that's just, again, like such a broad term, where if you just take a little longer between meals, like we're all always theoretically fasting by every time we're between meals, but just taking a little bit more time between meals. Well, now it makes it harder to eat as much, right? At first, and believe me, I've done this where I'm pretty good at eating one meal a day now. And at first, when you do that, it's hard to overeat. It gets real easy to do that after a few months, right? Like you can absolutely have 3,500 calories to 5,000 calories. Depends on what you're eating. Like if you're not restricting yourself at all in that one meal, I mean, there's plenty of foods out there that are very, very dense in calories if you're not paying attention. So the point is like you have different strategies that may give you some success, but you're going to have to make another change at some point. So just be willing and open to say like, okay, this is my first strategy, but I'm going to probably have to make some others, and I'm open to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've played around a lot with in the past. At least I know when I first met you, sort of the fasting time restriction.
Yeah.
What's your experience been with that? I know you said early on it's hard to overeat, but it can become easy.
It's funny. Like it's been like a little blending of strategies where my years ago I was climbing Kilimanjaro. I knew I was going to be climbing Kilimanjaro, and I think I mentioned this on another podcast. I wanted to lose weight, and I think that ended up being a bad strategy. But regardless, that was my initial spark to try to lose weight. So I just started using MyFitnessPal, and I started to eat less calories based on their recommendations. And I also did what you were talking about before, where I would track my steps, I would track my amount of calories burned, and they kind of give you more calories to eat if you do more work. So I was playing that game of, eating a certain amount of calories, but I'd get to eat more if I worked out more. That worked for a while, and then that stopped working. So I took the kind of added calorie piece out of it. And I also found that when I had like a certain amount of calories to eat within a day, that it was more enjoyable for me and actually easier if I just ate less meals, right? So it kind of blended into a fasting naturally, just because I was looking at this at like end day calorie goal that I had, and I was like, I kind of, during my work day, I don't really need to go out and eat. Like there's other things I can do. I'm not always really hungry. Like I feel more productive when I'm not eating. So I'll just wait until the end of the day when I get home, and that's where like I won't have to be as restricted if I just save all my food for the end of the day. So it sort of happened naturally, and it became this skill that I got better at, and I'd like to think of it, it's a skill because at first you feel this sort of pull to eat at the same times that you normally eat every day, right? It's a habit to eat. Like, and I learned from that process of having to just moderate more and more that hunger is sort of full of shit. It's not like your stomach is empty. It's just, it's habitual, right? Like most of the people that we know are not actually truly hungry. Like we're not starving in a way that like people who are really malnourished are starving ever, right? So we're getting our hunger signals based on habit, based on maybe blood sugar changes, based on a lot of different factors. But what I noticed is if I was hungry and I didn't eat, I didn't get more hungry progressively. I got less hungry sometimes, right? It just, there was ebbs and flows to it. If I drank water, sometimes I had no calories, but I just drank water, I got less hungry. If I took a nap, I got less hungry. If I exercised, I got less hungry. So I didn't actually need to put food into my body to get like that hunger quenched in a way. So it just became like a learning process. And then I read a book by Jason Fung that, I think it was The Complete Guide to Fasting. And anytime I read something, I have to like do it. I have to go like into it more. So then I got a little deeper into it and I'm like, all right, can I do like 4-day fast and things like that just as an assessment? I remember you were observing me the one time I tried to do I felt pretty good with exercise, but then I tried to do the snatch test and I got to like 65 reps
Oh
and I was
yeah.
like, that was the limit of with no food for 4 days. But it was a learning process, and now I'm kind of at the point where if I have to go there, like I feel like there's a tolerance I built to it that I can, but I also think that there's some things I was missing out on by always fasting. Right. So now I tend to make sure I at least get my protein. Like if I'm trying to get like, 160 to 170 grams of protein close to my body weight, I'm trying to put that in a couple times throughout the course of the day instead of trying to fit that in all at the end of the night for digestion purposes. But I definitely think that there's something to the fact that like your protein synthesis, you're not going to get a lot of what you're eating if you put 160 grams in one meal, right? Like you're not going to absorb it all. So I'm trying to get more protein throughout the course of the day. And then there's just times where like if I do jujitsu, if I work out like and I know I have to go really hard, I want glycogen. So simple sugars, I'll do a lot in the middle of the day if I am working out really hard. But like I'm kind of figured out what those type of workouts look like, and which ones I feel like I don't really need food for. So again, it's a learning process, and I can't really say to any other individual like what they should do. But I would just say like don't look at it as like one thing. Look at it as just part of your process for maybe monitoring how much you're eating.
Definitely. Yeah, I'd say I do a hybrid of everything too, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe to less extent. But yeah, I tend to save more calories for the end of the day because it's
Right.
like you just relax. Like, yeah, I mean there's a lot to that, but I've noticed the big lunches knock me out for the
Yeah.
second half of
Yeah.
the day. So
Exactly.
just like by default, I'm like, all right, I'm just gonna eat less, makes it easier, I'm more productive. Like there's the benefits are numerous.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think we have similar schedules too, right? So it really does matter your schedule. Like I feel more productive with less food, but there are certain foods where I can look at it as like if I just want to put something in my body, if I need a little bit of energy, like I almost separate out in my head food from supplementation, even though I'm like eating actual food and I'm not taking like a pill. If I'm taking like some simple sugars right before I exercise, I don't look at that as a meal. I still might track that as calories,
Yeah.
but it's just in my head. It's not like, oh, I'm actually sitting down for a meal. I'm just like getting that on the go. And I'm using that for a very specific purpose. And then
Yeah.
there's eating where it's like, all right, I'm going to enjoy it socially, where I don't actually want to pay that much attention to the quality of the food. I just want to eat the things I like to eat, right? There's times for that. And I think it's important to have different compartments in your head for those things and have different strategies for those things. Because, like you don't want to always be sort of a machine with how you're eating, but you want to know the difference, right? Like you want to know when you're being mindless with your food and you're doing that purposely, right? So you're mindfully mindless, right? Like you are actually planning out a time where, all right, I'm just not going to pay attention. I will deal with the consequences after that event, after that vacation. But then I've done this so many times, I can go right back into a strategy for getting me back into health, getting me back into feeling a certain way I want to feel or look a way I want to look. Right. So again, it's part of an ongoing learning process, and you develop confidence in that process, just like you develop confidence in like your fitness from an exercise standpoint, because you've been exercising a long time and you know what your strength is, you know what your speed is, et cetera. So
Yeah.
it's just another process to train.
Yeah, absolutely. I also just think it's like you can go so far down one way or the other and having the ability to come back it's a neutral or somewhat towards the center is probably good.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think like you said, it's easy to get robotic with food, which might actually, it could potentially kind of disturb a healthy relationship with food, and
Sure.
it's complex already. And then, but
Yeah.
then on the other end, it's like, I think especially living in America, it's like a lot of people have the opposite where all they know is kind of uncontrolled. And so I
Yes.
think finding that balance for people is the key, because it is so complex. Like
Mhm.
there's social ramifications of it. Yeah, I just
Yeah.
yeah. There's a lot to this. I feel like we could do like 15 episodes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the last thing I'll say is like there's so many extremes within fitness in general, but especially within nutrition,
Yeah.
and none of those extremes are actually like fully incorrect, in my opinion. Like
Hmm.
it's just the fact that they're extreme becomes the problem, right? So if you understand sort of why people might have an extreme view, like then and you can look at, okay, yeah, here's actually the benefit that these people that are screaming from the mountaintops are actually talking about. There's some truth to it, but the things that they're judging and crapping on might not actually be as bad as you think, or that you need context to all of it,
Yeah.
right? And that's where if you start to gain all of that context, so you could be in all of the different camps and and still understand where everybody's coming from and then figure out what works uniquely for you. I've since like my mid 20s, I actually started watching my nutrition. I'm 40 now. And the first thing I did is I followed LL Cool J's diet in his book, and this is before there was like podcasts and things like that. And it worked great because it was the first time I actually paid attention to what I ate. And LL Cool J was jacked. It was like, I want to look like that. But it was really just, tracking my calories and eating a lot of protein. The
Yeah.
second, then I was still drinking then. So I still like, I felt good except for the weekends when I was binge drinking. But then I gave up booze, and when I gave up booze, it was like a lot easier to make changes. Duh, right? Because I didn't have the weekend of overindulging. But then after that, I was like, okay, well, I gave up booze. I feel like I can give other things up. Like I had a confidence in renunciation. So then I became a vegan.
Hmm.
I was a vegan for a year and a half, and that was a process where I learned a lot, but I also felt myself biasing everything towards like pro vegan because like you sort of
Yeah.
feel like you have to because that's the thing that you're doing. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily if you understand that you're doing it, right? Like there's
Hmm.
something wrong with it if you're judging everything else. But if you're sort of like, okay,
Definitely.
I'm creating this strategy so it makes it easier for me to be compliant with this hard thing. Um, so like I feel I'm going to look into more things that are pro vegan because I'm vegan, right? And I think that happens naturally. You just have to be careful, like you don't judge other things, because then if you get too deep into judgment, it's harder to change, and your body might tell you to change at some point. It probably will. I definitely like was ignoring the fact that like I had gas all the time, and like I was ignoring the fact that like I was definitely losing muscle mass, and I wasn't as educated on nutrition because I didn't have as much experience with nutrition. So there's things I could have done then when I had no animal products coming in that could have probably kept muscle mass on more than I did. But I felt good in many other ways because up to that point I'd really never, like, I always just worked out to try to get like more bodybuilding style. Like I thought like having muscle mass was sort of like the be all end all of fitness. And then all of a sudden I was losing a little bit of that, but my cardio felt better, right? And so it made me think differently about stuff, and that's where
Yeah.
you have to be open to learning, right? And then I went paleos for a while when I was in the CrossFit world, and like, so I think a lot of people's introduction into nutrition is through some type of term, right? Is through this idea of I'm vegan, I'm paleo, I'm carnivore. Like there's and then what I hear from when you listen to podcasts is then people will then backtrack from that into a more moderate understanding of what
Yeah.
all of these different things offer. So my hope in this podcast is to try to get people there first, as opposed to
Yeah.
having to go to the extremes and then come back to the middle.
Right. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Hopefully this was useful for our huge audience, for our
Yep.
growing audience, let's say that.
Yeah,
um
I like that.
but if we get some questions, we can do some follow-up, certainly.
Sounds good. Look forward to it.
All right, look forward to next week.
All right. See you then.
Yeah.